surprised to find the back of the barn open wide. This had happened once or twice before over the years, and usually meant he had to run back home and get his father and Philly so they could hunt down all the pigs, who even in cold weather would head out in an effort to find food or get into something. But tonight, that wasn't an issue, for all the hogs were huddled as far from the door as possible and very reluctant to go out, even on a clear night. Assuming the pigs had gotten a bit of sense and didn't want to deal with the weather, he headed through the pen to close up the door, with Shorty following him the whole way. He gets there and Shorty takes one sniff, before darting out the door howling and barking the whole way, obviously chasing after something. Shorty, my father would say, was a bit of a tattletale. If something was misbehaving, he'd try to stop it. When sneaking out or getting up past bedtime, you had to make sure the dog didn't see you do it. This applied to other animals too, and if a pig or chicken didn't do what it was supposed to, the dog would get into it. So with that in mind, my father didn't think perhaps the dog was after something, but that it instead was scolding a hog that had wandered off alone. After all, pigs all look alike, move a good bit, and my father wasn't brilliant. My father counted up the pigs and noticed that one, an adult boar, was missing. So he headed out after Shorty to find the lost pig. In the still and the snow, it was easy to find Shorty. All he had to do was follow the dog's footprints, but that was when he realized something was wrong. Shorty's prints were in the snow, but they weren't following the tracks of the hog. In fact, there were no prints from the hog, which there should have been. No new snow had fallen, and there wasn't enough wine to easily cover them. And furthermore, there were tracks, they just weren't from a pig. Instead, they were large, vague dents in the snow. These, my father recognized. He had seen them before in the woods the year before, if only briefly. And here they were again, with Shorty on hot pursuit of the creature. Mustering up his courage, my father followed them as well. After all, he wanted his dog back, and scared or not, he needed to at least look for him in the hog, or his father would kill him. The pen was decent sized for a hog pen, but soon he hit the fence, which was made up of 5-foot-tall hog panels. Shorty was capable of climbing these. I'm assuming his build was more beagle than basset, because the image of a basset hound climbing a fence is hilarious to me, and he could see that the dog had already gone over the fence and into the woods. Of course, the fence hadn't stopped the white man, either. His tracks simply went right over the fence, as if he hadn't even had to break stride to get over it. So he climbed the fence, soon was in the woods, for the UP is really just woods and cleared woods for pens and buildings, and it wasn't long before he heard the barks of Shorty, and the squeals of a frightened pig. Running now, he came to the scene quickly. Standing among the trees was the white man, who had seemingly grown bigger over the last year. In one arm, he held the struggling and screaming hog, which had to have weighed at least 400 pounds. A few feet away from him carrying on, was Shorty, his hair on end and teeth bared, acting as if he had cornered the beast. There was no communication or confrontation between them. There was just an impression. An impression that the white man had waited for him, that he had stood there ignoring the dog, just so he could get a glimpse of him. There was a brief pause. Then my father realized something terrible. The white man did, in fact, have a mouth. Below the beady black eyes was a slit, a long line, and it opened just a bit to reveal teeth as white as the rest of him, that shined in the moonlight. Just as quickly as he flashed his grin, he was gone. The white man silently took off, running into the woods, gracefully dodging between trees, with just the soft crunch of snow following him. Shorty took a few steps after him before my father had the mind to call him back, and the two headed home with my father sobbing the whole way. Of course, he got into trouble. He had the sense to not tell his parents what he saw, but still got in trouble for losing a hog. He only ended up telling Philly because he couldn't stop crying, and even then he couldn't stop. Philly didn't apparently believe him much, but he didn't say anything to argue against it. Philly eventually began to write off everything as my father being schizophrenic, and the white man being the manifestation of it. I know nothing of mental disease, so I don't know how the diagnosis would ever hold up. Anyway, years went by before my father saw the white man again, although he claims to have known he was there during that time. Every winter, without fail, one hog or a group of chickens in a single night would go missing. Only once was there an exception. One year, a local boy went missing in the woods and never turned up. That year, no hog went missing from the farm. It was the livestock as well as the sharp teeth that led my father to the conclusion that the white man had to eat, and that he wasn't a vegetarian. The white man, though, never once told him he killed his victims, nor that he ate them. Considering what he took though, my father thought it was easy enough to figure out. When he was 16, he saw the white man again. The exact age I remember, for it was when my father began driving. It was late at night and my father was driving home. He had begun to work at the nearest gas station, sometimes not coming home until 8. It's worth noting that my father had his own set of skills and talents, such as being a hard worker or an excellent cook, but driving, especially in the winter, was not on that list. Driving scared my father. He was terrified of slipping or crashing, and drove very slowly and very cautiously. Never one to yell at us, he'd snap if we talked too loudly in the car or turned the radio up too high, because it would begin to make him nervous. With that in mind, what I am about to tell you shouldn't surprise you. He crashed. Granted, he crashed trying to stop and help someone else who had crashed. But he still crashed. Another car had slid into the ditch along the rarely traveled road towards his house, and in the process of trying to stop and help, he too had an accident, one that was much more violent than the one he was trying to help. Somehow or another, he ended up hitting a tree hard enough to seriously damage his car and injure his leg. The other driver of the other car came out to help him, and after realizing he couldn't walk back to town, decided to walk back on his own and get help for the both of them. My father thanked him, and the man went on his way. Now granted, it was hillbilly hell, winter, in the middle of nowhere. But it would, by my father's calculations, take less than an hour for the man to get back to the gas station and find help, and less than an hour for them to get back to him, because then they'd be driving, right? So in 2 hours, he'd be in the heated cab of a tow truck, either on the way to his house or a doctor's office. It was about midnight at that point, and my father had a wristwatch on which he'd check occasionally as he shivered in the dark. 1 a.m. comes around. 2 a.m. comes around. 3. 4. He dozes off, and wakes up shivering to the sound of footsteps, big and heavy like a man's. For whatever reason, he assumes that the guy couldn't find help, or that help couldn't get down the road, and he's come back to help him. Or maybe the guy just up and left and some other traveler has come to see if he's alive. He pulls himself up enough to look out the rear-view mirror, and that's when the pit dropped out of the bottom of his stomach. For, you see, there wasn't a man in the snow. Even though he should have been able to see someone if he could hear them, there wasn't anyone there. The footsteps are, but there wasn't a person. According to him, he felt like he was in a nightmare and began looking frantically behind him, trying to see someone, hoping he was just overreacting. But then he saw a long white form step in front of the brown and black of the trees, and realized it was the white man again, slowly stepping towards the car. His movement slow and graceful, but he seems a little worried. My father's never seen them in the open before, but here he is, moving cautiously like a cat, when it's worried about being seen at night. Eventually, the thing gets to the car words, no begging. In fact, although my father was scared shitless, he again just climbed up and held still as they began talking. This time, the conversation was short, one sentence not said inside my father's mind. Don't worry. Already paid. With that, the giant keeps on moving, making a point of going across the road and into the woods on the other side as my father watched. Comedically, he always made a point to tell us that the white man stopped before crossing, making a point of checking for traffic, before heading across. Once the beast was out of sight, my father began sobbing and kept sobbing until the mailman, even in the UP, you gotta get mail, found him 4 hours later. My father recovered, although he ended up having to spend a small fortune getting the car repaired. The other driver? A bit less lucky. He simply never showed up again. He left to find help, but never made it back into town. An investigation was opened, but leads all sputtered out. Mind you, this last story is probably the last one for a bit that I remember clearly. Some of the others may be a bit fuzzy because it's been about 10 years since I really heard any of them. Somehow, my father knew that the white man was attached to the winter. This surely wasn't a surprise to anyone at all, seeing as he was a white monster in the UP that only showed up when snow fell. The issue, of course, was that it was often winter in the UP. A few more years went by, with no really noteworthy incidents. The white man would take something every winter, but it didn't get Shorty or my grandmother or anything. By now, my father was 18 or 19 and getting ready to leave. His family was poor, and even if they hadn't been, my grandfather did not believe in college. With his sons now men, he gave them an option. Become farmers, clergymen, lumberjacks, laborers, or get out and don't come back. It was because of Philly that they didn't do that, although I'm sure my father wanted to get away from the winter. Philly decided they'd both join the military and get out of there. Vietnam had recently ended and he would joke that he thought he'd get sent somewhere warm that had never seen snow. I guess I could lie and for comedy's effect say they both were sent to Alaska or Russia, but the truth is a bit more boring. They were accepted and went through basic training but neither ever saw combat. Philly was removed from service for a birth defect eventually and my father stayed in but never did anything until his contract ran up, merely working on bases those few years. He asked to be transferred somewhere warm, and being liked by his higher-ups, found himself in Texas. With it getting late, I'm admittedly going to wrap things up a bit faster than I'd planned. My father had tons of stories about weird things they'd find in the woods before he left the UP and other odd incidents he tied vaguely to the white man, but it was some time before he saw him again. After all, if he was tied to Winter, it'd be a while before there'd be a reunion in Texas. But towards the end of my father's military contract a storm hit the area he was stationed in and brought with it snow. Being one of the few on the base who had any knowledge of how to handle the mess, he saw himself outside a lot during the storm. And it didn't take long before he realized the white man could travel. The storm lasted 2 days. On the second day, he woke early to the ice paths and roads. In a desolate part of the base, he was surprised to see another soldier in the distance, and grew a bit concerned when he realized the man wasn't moving. Quickly, he approached him, only to realize something. Again, there were no footprints leading out to this man, who he now realized was devoid of color, a detailed white shape with 2 dark eyes. If he hadn't been so surprised, he'd have screamed. Instead, he claimed he probably looked as white as the white man, as the color left him no interest. With that, the figure vanished. My father was found some time later by a fellow soldier, staring into the distance across an open field. Exhaustion was his supposed excuse. 2 days later, he received a call from his older sister, informing him that his father had died. There wasn't much detail to go into. His father had simply fallen over in the field and died while feeding hogs, and that was that. No mess. No fuss. My father, understandably, didn't care much. If the white man did it, it wasn't much of a punishment. But he eventually came to decide the white man was, if nothing else, a bad omen. Admittedly, it's now 4 a.m. for me. I'm heading to bed, but if the thread's still up tomorrow and there's any interest I'll wrap it up with the last 2 or 3 stories I had that are of any interest. I hope at least a few of you got somewhat of a kick out of it, which leads me to asking a question. Anyone have any idea what this thing was, if he wasn't just blowing smoke out his ass or crazy? Any legends of anything like this? Hey guys, Keck here. I have found the rest of the stories. If you want to hear them, please let me know. If enough of you ask in the comments I will post it tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you guys later. Needless to say, my father grew afraid of snow in the winter. When his contract ended a year or so after that, he returned to the UP for one summer to help his mother deal with the mess that was the home place. I need to pause here to describe my family on my father's side. You need to remember as well that I never met most of them, knowing them only through old family photos and family story which don't all involve winter monsters. My father was 28 when he married, and 32 when he became a father. On the other hand, his parents had been together since his mother was 14 and his father 18. His parents were not old when all their children moved away, but they also were old in that way only he'll